Formula One teams go through many different phases, with different drivers, engineers, and leadership. Now that the 2022 season had just ended, people are now starting to retire and move on to new aspirations. Some of these people include Sebastian Vettel retiring as a driver, Binotto announcing his retirement from Ferrari as their team principal, and Josh Capito stepping down as a Williams team principal. The Williams team is now going through another team principal change, not long after Claire Williams stepped down in 2020, the deputy team principal and daughter of the team founder, Sir Frank Williams. Claire Williams became deputy team principal back in 2013, and although she wasn't officially the team principal, Claire and Frank would often work hand in hand and offer each other suggestions and guidance for the team, similar to how Frank would run the team with the help of his wife, Virginia Williams. Better known as Ginny Williams, Frank's wife played an important role in the early development of the Williams team. Even before they were married, Ginny quit her job, sold her house, and used some of the money to fund Frank and the team. In her book, A Different Kind of Life, Ginny goes into detail about some of the sacrifices she made for the Williams team early on. Ginny contributed to the team with more than just money. Going into the 1985 season, Frank didn't know who to choose for a driver. Frank and Patrick Head, the co-founder of Williams Racing, considered a multitude of people and eventually set their eyes on a specific driver. Ready to pull the trigger, Frank and Patrick invited this individual to their house for dinner and to eventually sign the contract to be one of the two drivers for the 1985 season. The driver stayed the night, and the next morning after they had left, Frank asked his wife what she had thought about him as the next potential driver, to which Ginny said, "Oh, for God's sakes, absolutely not." Frank was surprised by his wife's reaction and asked her why, what on earth did he do? Where Ginny responded, "The guy made his bed this morning. No racing driver worth their salt makes their bed." Ginny believed that racing drivers were too busy being a racing driver and would never do anything as mundane as making your own bed. She sat down with Frank and told him, "I don't understand why you aren't picking Nigel Mansell. You need to pick Nigel." And lo and behold, Nigel became a driver for Williams for the 1985 season. Ginny had so much influence in the driver selection that even Claire herself said there was no way Nigel would have driven for Williams during the 80s if it weren't for Ginny. The Williams car for the 1985 season was the FW10. It was powered by a Honda engine and was only the second full season of incorporating a turbo. And although the car had a rocky start, after it was dialed in by mid-season, it proved to be a competitive car, fast enough for Nigel to claim his first Formula One victory at the 1985 European Grand Prix held at Brands Hatch. Getting another win at the next race, Nigel finished 6th in the Drivers' Championship. Nigel's second season at Williams was even better, where he claimed 9 podiums, 5 of which were first place finishes. Eventually, he led the Drivers' Championship going into the final race in Australia with a 6-point lead. The race was an amazing 3-way fight for the championship between Nigel, Alain Prost, and Nelson Piquet. Nigel was on track to win the championship until he suffered a rear left tire blowout that ultimately retired the car. The championship just within reach to be slipped away and claimed by Prost. The season after, Nigel was again the runner-up in the Drivers' Championship, and for his final season at Williams in 1988, he placed a staggering 9th. For the next 2 seasons, Nigel drove for Ferrari, where in 1990 he had a terrible season. His car was incredibly unreliable, and in turn led to 7 retirements in the season. Of the whole season, Nigel was only able to claim 1 win. Along with being teammates with Alain Prost, who was a 3-time world champion at this point and who was deemed to be the number 1 driver for the pair, Nigel announced his retirement from Formula One. Nigel backed up his decision, saying that enough was enough and that I was never going to get the support I obviously needed to get across the line. Nigel was perfectly happy with retiring at this point, until a certain man approached Mansell again. Prost and Senna were both originally going to be driving for Williams for the 1991 season, until both of them declined the offer after deeming the car wasn't quick enough. This meant that Frank Williams had no drivers for the next season, and that he needed to fill those spots with talent. Frank offered the seat to Nigel in hopes that he would unretire, but Nigel gave him a list of demands and only agreed to drive if they could be met, with the main focus around him being the number 1 driver. Frank told Nigel what he was asking for was impossible, and considered rescinding the offer. But 3 weeks later, Frank came back and agreed to meet the demands. Nigel then drove for Williams for 2 years, where he absolutely dominated the 1992 season. Of all the races that Nigel finished and did not have to retire the car, he placed only first and second. That is absolutely insane to think that second place was his lowest finish if you exclude DNFs. Nigel finished the season with nearly double the runner-up's points and claimed his World Driver Championship that he was so desperately fighting for. Frank clearly saw the talent Nigel had during his first stint at Williams, so much so he was willing to pull strings for the impossible and nearly begged him to come back. Frank stated that Nigel was one hell of a racer, and that whenever he went racing, the horns came out and he was off. Formula 1 is all about being in the right place at the right time. Who knows if Mansell would have came back to F1 to claim his one and only Drivers' Championship if it weren't for Frank. And who knows if Frank would have ever seen his potential if he didn't drive for Williams. And finally, who knows if Nigel would have ever drove for Williams if it weren't for the bed that was made. Thanks for sticking around and for all the positive comments on my last video of why Kimi Räikkönen had blue hands during this race. Consider subscribing if you enjoyed these stories and to stay up to date of when I release the next video.